How did we get from George Washington to Donald Trump? When we think about US history, we often turn to what we learned in our textbooks: the Revolutionary War, independence from Britain, the Civil War, even the role the US played in both world wars. But this understanding of the US is incredibly Eurocentric and leaves out a major piece of the puzzle that could help us better understand the historical moment we're living through. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author Greg Grandin points out in his new book, Latin America has played a critical role in shaping the United States as we know it, and vice versa. In his new book that's called America, America, A New History of the New World, Grandin walks us through how our southern neighbors have influenced the United States from the era of the conquistadors to the current moment we find ourselves in. And amid the rise of fascism, he argues that Latin America provides valuable lessons on how social democracy can combat right-wing authoritarianism. Greg Grandin joins me now to discuss. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the show. Congratulations on the book and getting on the New York Times bestseller list. So much to talk about, but let's start here. When most people talk about America, both here and across the world, they are referring to the United States of America. How did we get to that point? Why is Latin America so overlooked?
Well, the word, I mean, to get back to the word is America. The United States claimed the word America, even as they understood the rest of the continent was also America. And in the more expansionist visions of the founders, they imagined that that part of America would also become their part of America. There was more than one founder, including Thomas Jefferson, who thought both North and South America would be stacked with Saxons, within 100 years as Latin America receded. But the book it's really a 500-year history, starting with the conquest, and in many ways, even though I couldn't get into it in depth because it was happening concurrently. In some ways, it ends with Gaza, because the through line of the book is one. There's many through lines of the book, but one of them is Latin America's role in abrogating the doctrine of conquest. So I start with the conquest, and obviously we could bring it up to Gaza, a different kind of conquest, if I had more time to write about it. But the book is about how how Latin America has shaped the United States. But more than that, it's also how how Latin America, it's deep, and I'm going to sound romantic and sentimental here, but it's deep humanistic tradition, despite, and there's a tension throughout the book between the brutality of the conquest and the reaction to the brutality of the conquest, and the criticism and the humanist critique that emerges from the conquest creates, my argument is that it creates basically the liberal international order. It doesn't just shape the Americas or shape the United States. Wow. Latin America comes into the world already a League of Nations, already a United Nations, 6 or 7 republics that have to learn how to live with each other. It was unprecedented in history. And the United States, of course, comes into the world a single nation on a continent that they imagined to be empty. And it wasn't empty, I'm saying imagined to be empty, and they revived the doctrine of conquest to move west. Latin America was rejecting the doctrine of conquest. So the book is a sweeping book that deals with all of these issues, that brings us up to the current moment. Yes. In the sense that, what Donald Trump is doing more than anything else is he's reasserting the doctrine of conquest. Yes. I mean, you could say he's doing a lot of things, but one principal core thing is when he says that the United States has a right to Greenland and Canada, and that they could use aggressive force to do that. He's undoing centuries of work that were done within the New World. Yes. To create the liberal international order put in place in 1945.
So you have this book. You spent a lot of time working on this book, I'm sure, and then it comes out at the start of the Trump presidency, which, as you say, he's reasserting the doctrine of conquest. He wants the Panama Canal back. He's renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. How's that for some linguistic imperialism? And he's also praising James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine in a recent ABC News interview. So your book couldn't be better timed, could it?
Yeah, it can't be better timed, and there's so much going on. It's, my head's spinning because I don't know which op-ed to write first.
what did you
It's
make of
like,
the Gulf of
you know,
America renaming?
well, it's been called the Gulf of America since 1550, and I wrote something in the Guardian about this. It might as well be called the Gulf of America, considering how much we pollute it, considering the amount of radiation that dredged up from offshore oil, the toxicity that we've turned the Gulf of America. We might as well claim it of our own. But setting that aside, this is two things. One is it's part of the culture war, and the key aspect of the culture war is to constantly find new fronts to fight on. Right? There's never, it's always to
Yes.
find another thing: plastic straws, Slurpees, and the Gulf of America. I mean, who even thought about that? I mean, you must admit, Trump's kind of a genius. Now it's Alcatraz, but it's always a new thing. That's the culture war. And so, because the culture war is never about anything in particular, it's just about finding new things to attach resentment and grievances to. It has no, it's inherently, it inherently escalates. There is no end game to the culture war. So, okay, to get back to the Gulf of America, this is an argument in Trump's head, and it speaks to the nature of the book. Most Latin Americans call themselves Americans. So, I mean, you could put an accent on the Gulf of America, and everybody would be happy. But of course, Trump doesn't. Trump doesn't
So,
know that.
liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share, and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism. You said, Latin Americans call themselves Americans, and you talk about, the kind of appearance of emptiness and the conquest and the movement. Here's a question for you as someone who studied this. You look at Latin America today, and you look at some of the social democratic parties and leftist leaders, both today and in recent decades, who have come to power there and done some pretty impressive things, done bad things as well, but some impressive social democratic things in the fields of healthcare and education, the climate. And then you look at the US, where that's never happened, really. Like, you have to go back to FDR to get even close to kind of what Republicans like to call socialism. How did the two parts of America diverge in that way, where one is hospitable to social democracy and leftism and one traditionally isn't?
Well, it's a big question, and the book goes into it in depth, which we don't have time to go into the weeds here. I think there's a the social and intellectual history of Spanish Catholicism compared to British Protestantism. There's a certain evasion, and built into the British colonial project that didn't deal with social problems, that pushed them to the frontier, where Spanish Catholicism, for all of its horrors and all of its, creating a colonial state that extracted the New World's wealth and brought it back, and created enormous miseries, and led to the greatest human mortality rate in world history. 90% of the New World population gone within a century. For all of that, for all of those miseries, there was a kind of moral crisis within the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church presumed to be universal. And once it recognized Native Americans as humans, how do you justify that? And this, and it created a more direct grappling with the problems of society. Like, there was like, and so one of the book's main tensions, and we don't have time to go into all of the ways the intellectual ideas, the ideas integrated with the social history of exploitation and capitalism. But one of the main ideas is that Latin America is the origins of what we call social rights, what we call the right to educate, what we call the right, the obligation of a
Yes.
state to deliver basic goods to create a dignified life. Whereas the United States is the last bastion of individual rights. No other country in the world, especially rich countries, have cling to a notion of individual rights as fetishistically as the United States does. And what by individual rights I mean that, the only legitimate state is the state that restrains itself and allows
Yes.
individuals a greater realm of liberty to assemble, to believe, to speak, some say to own guns. There's
To
nothing in
lack
the US
healthcare.
Constitution about the state providing healthcare,
Yeah.
providing education,
So
and that tension between social rights and individual rights is marked and acute and it's a good framework for understanding the distinction between Latin America and the United States. And that's something I try to draw out. The good neighbor
yes.
policy and FDR was probably the highest moment of convergence when the United States began to accept the right to social rights. Some of
Yes.
FDR's brain trusters said, we don't really have to amend the Constitution. We could read it in a different way. We could read the right to life to mean the right to a healthy life,
Yes.
meaning
And they had their
the
Economic
right
Bill
to
of
health
Rights
care.
as well, didn't they?
But the right in this country since the 1970s has been engaged in a massive ideological campaign to reconsecrate individual rights and cast social rights as perverse and heretical. And that's a big tension in the book. So it's Bernie Sanders. When Bernie Sanders, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have
Yes.
national
But it's not.
health system. What he means by that is what he means by that is what the bigger thing is. What he means by that is we're the only country in the world that doesn't believe in social rights.
So it's interesting that you mentioned kind of other rich countries, but okay, we've got Canada, which Bernie often points to for its healthcare system, right next door to us. Having troubles with Canada these days, thanks to our president. But then you have Mexico to the south. Mexico just elected a woman president, a leftist president, Claudia Sheinbaum, to lead the country. The United States, at almost the same time, is electing a bigot, a convicted felon, a far-right authoritarian, Donald Trump. How do we begin to reckon with the difference between Mexico and the US right now? Right, literally side by side, you couldn't have a starker difference between the two leaders.
Well, the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, which more or less and not exactly corresponded with the good neighbor policy. And it was that moment of conversion, of reform, of creating states that broke away from extreme obsessive liberalism and began to imagine the kind of building out of a social state in different ways. Cardenas in Mexico gave so much land back to the Yaqui. It would have been the equivalent of FDR if he had given back like Tennessee back to the Creeks, which of course would never have happened. But they did that in Mexico. Now, Mexico and the United States both suffered economic restructuring in the 70s, and Mexico's revolution was kind of lost to some degree. But what we see with Claudia Sheinbaum and what we see with the president that preceded her, AMLO, is a return to the values of the Mexican Revolution in a successful way. People constantly here talk about returning to the values of the New Deal. They're doing it. Like here, it never actually happens, right? We talk about the New Deal, but it never actually gets there. The thing about Latin America is it has this commitment to a kind of universalism. I mean, without romanticizing, without sentimentalism, the crime and corruption, people are desperate, the poverty, and the Cold War violence was off the charts, but they never give up on this conception of democracy, at least in spirit, right? Even if any given country might go any given way in an election. For every Mexico, there's an El Salvador. For every Brazil, there's now an Ecuador.
So on that note, Greg, on that note, it's interesting that you can look at social democracy in Latin America, but you can also look at the history of fascism, right? The classic juntas, the generals, we have this image of kind of tin pot dictatorships often comes out of Latin America, the phrase banana republic, all of that stuff that comes out of, you mentioned the Cold War violence. And even today, you mentioned culture wars earlier. You have Milei in Argentina, Bukele obviously in El Salvador, mimicking Trump in their own ways. And yet you do have a history of resistance to fascism and overcoming the Pinochets and others. So what can Americans in North America, in the United States of America, what can they learn from Latin Americans in terms of resisting fascism? What lessons can they learn from Latin American history that might be useful right now in the US in 2025?
Well, the contexts are different. They can't just mimic
Yep.
what Klein Steinbaum are doing. The countries are very different. But one thing that they can do is Latin American Democrats know that the way that you don't beat fascists by calling fascists fascist. You beat fascists by offering an alternative. And a broad vision of social democracy. You promise to make the material conditions of people's lives better in real ways, and that if liberalism is going to be revived from its near moribund state, the only way it's going to be revived is by welding it, as Latin Americans consistently do, to a robust program of social rights, unapologetic unapologetic social rights, that we are, that it's the government's job to create universal programs that improve people's lives. Now, again, Latin America is a poor region. It's not Scandinavia. It doesn't have no,
Yes.
it has there's a lot of things, there's a lot of crime, and there's a lot of fallback. But the one thing that Latin Americans have been fighting fascism. The World War II didn't end after after in 1945 for Latin Americans. It just migrated back to Latin America. I mean, they've been fighting fascists throughout, since World War I. In some ways, the United States globalized fascism with the Cold War,
Yes.
and by what during the Good Neighbor policy, the U.S. supported the left against the right to great and enormous and wondrous success on many levels. The Cold War came, and the U.S.
Yes.
switched, and the result was catastrophic.
And we've never
But
really had a
still,
reckoning with
despite
that, I think, as well. I think most Americans have no
yeah,
clue
no
about what
reckoning
happened
with
in
that, no
Guatemala
reckoning with that.
or Chile or
No, in Chile,
yes.
and
So
everything, but despite that violence, and despite the depredations of economic restructuring, what we call neoliberalism, Latin Americans never listened to, the followers of Hayek. They never seem to come to believe that national health
yeah.
insurance will
Although we
turn
now
you
have,
into a
although
serf.
we now have this libertarian
you know,
libertarian dude in Argentina, don't we?
yeah, because there has been a massive importation of the culture
Yes,
wars
very
into
good
Latin
point.
America.
Last question, Greg.
You know,
Towards the end of the book, you
sure.
write, Wilson imagined a world without war. FDR imagined a world without fear or want. Today's political class imagines nothing. Its grand strategies do no better than offer perilous talk of a new Cold War, of restarting nuclear testing, abrogating disarmament treaties, rearming Germany and Japan, expanding NATO, and garrisoning Africa. I just wonder, do you have any faith in the current Democratic Party to have some moral political imagination that fires people up, that helps beat fascism?
Well, there's these three currents, right? There's the Bernie Sanders and AOC
Yep.
current, and we could criticize them for their timidity on Gaza, but they do have a vision. I mean, calling for Medicare for all is exactly what I'm talking about. Then there's the people who say we should just fight, like Pritzker, but fight for what? You have to fight for
Yeah.
something. You can't just say you have to
Yep.
fight. And there's a lot of those people. We have to fight, but okay, but come up with a program to fight
Yes.
for. And then there's the technocrats, the abundance people. New York Times read an article about how the Democrats need a plan 2029 of their own. And I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. What's going to be in this plan? National health insurance, universal child care, paid maternity leave. No, none of those things. The plan 2029 was the government had to learn how to deregulate and deliver service more efficiently like a business. I mean, that's not going to defeat the conspiratorial world making of the right. The right is involved in a world making
Yep.
project that gives them meaning, that you know, where they understand things, where things are connecting, and there's never an end to it. It's like the upside down world and Stranger Things that they're building, and you don't and the right you have to fight ideology with
Yes,
ideology.
well said.
And that an ideology in itself isn't a bad thing, and an ideology of humanism, an ideology of universalism, an ideology in which which the state's role is to make people's lives materially better, is an ideology. And if the Democrats can adopt that, which I don't have that much faith that they will,
Yeah.
considering it's captured by lobbyists and Uber executives and consultants
Well,
and APAC, but you know, I mean, something has to happen. Things change.
something has to happen, things change. Spoken like a true historian. Greg Grandin, author of America, which is on the New York Times bestseller list. It's out now.
Yeah, here it is.
Buy your copy of the book. And also go to Zeteo.com, where we have our book club, and Greg's book is included in the book club. And check out some of the other authors and books that we've discussed on this show. Greg Grandin, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mehdi. It's great. It's been really great. Great conversation.
Yes. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.